Hey guys, tonight we begin with something big. Like really big. Empires. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your phone rest on your chest. Maybe stare at the ceiling a little. Tonight we're drifting through some of the most powerful empires in Asian history. Massive kingdoms. Golden courts. War elephants. And, of course, deeply complicated rulers who absolutely needed therapy but instead chose conquest. We'll move slowly. No dramatic battle music. No shouting generals. Just calm storytelling about people who controlled millions of lives and still couldn't manage their own family dynamics. Let's begin in ancient India, around the 4th century BC, with a young man who looked at the political chaos around him and thought, "You know what this needs? Me." His name was Chandragupta Maurya. He rose to power in a landscape that had just been shaken by Alexander the Great's brief but noisy visit. Alexander had marched in, made a mess, then died at 32 like an overachiever who forgot to pace himself. Chandragupta stepped into that vacuum with ambition, guidance from his famously intense advisor Chanakya, and probably a very strong belief that destiny had personally emailed him. He overthrew the Nanda dynasty. He consolidated northern India. He built what became the Maurya Empire. And this wasn't small. This was enormous. At its height, it covered most of the Indian subcontinent, which is not a casual achievement. The capital was Pataliputra, a city described by Greek visitors as massive, fortified, and impressively organized. Chandragupta's rule was highly structured, bureaucratic, efficient, a little intense. The state monitored trade, agriculture, spies. Yes, spies. Because nothing says stable empire like an elaborate intelligence network. Greek diplomat Megasthenes visited and wrote about how everything seemed controlled, categorized, and supervised. It was orderly, almost suspiciously orderly. And then after building this giant machine of governance, Chandragupta did something very calm and very dramatic at the same time. He abdicated. He converted to Jainism. He renounced worldly life. And, according to tradition, fasted to death in southern India, which is the pivot from conquering emperor to ascetic monk. Minimalist lifestyle. No palace. No elephants. Just quiet reflection. Honestly, kind of impressive. Now, let's float forward to his grandson. Because the Mauryas were just getting started. Enter Ashoka. Ashoka began his reign like many powerful rulers do. Confident, ambitious, very into expansion. He fought a brutal campaign against Kalinga. The war was devastating. Ancient sources describe massive casualties. And here's where things get interesting. After witnessing the destruction, Ashoka had what we might gently call a moral meltdown. He was horrified by the suffering, deeply disturbed. Instead of doubling down, he turned toward Buddhism. He embraced nonviolence. He promoted Dharma, moral law, compassion, ethical living. He carved edicts into stone pillars across his empire. Literally carved. Imagine being so committed to your rebrand that you commission rock pillars across thousands of miles just to say, "Actually, I've changed." But he meant it. He reduced military campaigns, encouraged religious tolerance, built infrastructure, supported monks. Under Ashoka, the Maurya Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. It was massive, wealthy, administratively sophisticated. And yet, after Ashoka died, things slowly unraveled. Because empires are very good at expansion, less good at succession planning. His successors lacked his authority. Regional governors grew stronger. The centralized system loosened. And within decades, the great Mauryan machine began to fragment, which is often how it goes. Build something enormous, Rule brilliantly.
Die.
Watch it wobble. But for a moment in history, the Mauryas created one of the most powerful empires Asia had ever seen. Now, let's gently drift east. To China. To a time when the idea of unified China didn't really exist yet. The land was divided into warring states, competing kingdoms, constant conflict. And out of that chaos rose a man who believed that unity could be achieved through one simple principle: absolute control. His name was Qin Shi Huang. He founded the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE. He unified China, standardized weights and measures, standardized currency, standardized writing, even standardized axle widths for carts. Because if you're going to unify civilization, you might as well regulate traffic spacing. He was efficient, brilliant, and extremely authoritarian. He suppressed dissent, burned books, buried scholars alive, allegedly. He believed intellectual disagreement was bad for national unity, which is one way to approach it. He also began construction on what would become the Great Wall's early foundations, and of course commissioned his famous terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with unique facial features, to guard him in the afterlife. Because ruling the living wasn't enough. He wanted post-mortem security. But despite all this power, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions searching for elixirs. He consumed mercury pills believed to grant eternal life. Spoiler: mercury is not great for longevity. He died at 49. After his death, the Qin dynasty collapsed quickly. Harsh laws, heavy labor demands, popular resentment. It didn't last. But the idea of a unified China did. And that idea carried into the next dynasty, the Han dynasty. Under the Han, China became a true superpower of the ancient world. Long-lasting, culturally vibrant, economically strong. The Silk Road expanded. Trade connected China to Central Asia and beyond. Confucian ideals shaped governance. Civil service systems began forming. The Han emperors didn't always live peacefully. Court intrigue was constant. Eunuchs gained influence. Empresses maneuvered for power. Imperial relatives schemed. Because absolute power never travels alone. It brings cousins. Still, the Han created durable institutions. They refined bureaucracy. They supported scholarship. For 4 centuries, they maintained imperial structure, which in ancient terms is basically forever. Eventually, internal strife and external pressures eroded stability. Regional warlords rose. The empire fractured. But much like the Mauryas and Qin before them, the Han left a blueprint. And tonight, as you lie there, slowly drifting, notice the pattern forming. An ambitious founder, rapid expansion, centralized control, brilliant administration, then succession problems, court politics, gradual fragmentation. It's almost comforting in its predictability. Empires rise. Empires consolidate. Empires quietly fall apart while insisting everything is fine. Part 2. The Mongols, horseback, world domination, and some very awkward family dinners. All right, let's ease back in. You're still comfortable, still warm, still drifting. Tonight we continue our calm journey through Asia's most powerful empires. And now we ride, gently, softly, across the grasslands of Central Asia, where in the late 12th century, a boy named Temujin was having an absolutely terrible childhood. This boy would grow up to become Genghis Khan, which sounds dramatic. But at first, he was just a kid whose father was poisoned. His family was abandoned by their tribe. They survived by eating wild plants and, occasionally, small animals. It was not glamorous. Temujin grew up learning one clear lesson. Trust no one. Organize everything. And he did. Through alliances, betrayals, loyalty oaths, and a suspiciously strong ability to remember who wronged him, he united the Mongol tribes. By 1206, he declared himself Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Because subtlety was not really the Mongol brand. Now, if you imagine an empire beginning with marble palaces and silk curtains, you would be wrong. This empire began on horseback. The Mongol Empire expanded at a speed that made sedentary kingdoms deeply uncomfortable. Mongol armies were fast,
Disciplined.
highly coordinated. They used composite bows, feigned retreats, psychological warfare. If they besieged a city, they often gave it a choice: surrender peacefully or don't. Many cities chose incorrectly. We'll keep it calm tonight, so we won't dwell on the destruction. Just know that the Mongols were very, very effective. Within a few decades, they controlled territory stretching from China to Eastern Europe. That's not a casual weekend project. And at the center of it all was Genghis Khan. He promoted based on merit, not noble birth, which for the 13th century was oddly progressive. But he also expected absolute loyalty, which for the 13th century was very on-brand. He had many wives and many children. And here is where things get administratively complicated. Because when you conquer half the known world and have numerous sons, succession becomes less of a plan and more of a looming thundercloud. After Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire did not collapse immediately. Instead, it was divided among his sons and grandsons, which sounds peaceful. It was not. Let's gently float to one of the most famous descendants, Kublai Khan. Kublai was a grandson of Genghis. He shifted focus toward China. In 1271, he declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty. He ruled from Beijing. He adopted many Chinese administrative practices, which caused tension among more traditional Mongols who preferred steppe life and probably felt the palace lifestyle was getting a bit soft. Kublai maintained a massive, multicultural empire. Trade flourished. Foreign visitors arrived, including a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. Marco Polo wrote enthusiastically about the wealth and organization of Kublai's court. Whether he exaggerated is still debated, but the image stuck. An emperor presiding over one of the largest empires in history. And yet, even this vast structure was fragile. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured into separate khanates. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate. Family unity dissolved into regional politics. Because it turns out that ruling the largest land empire in history is difficult to maintain across generations. Who knew? Now, let's gently drift south. To India again. Several centuries later, where another empire was rising. The Mughal Empire. Founded in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur.
Yes.
That family tree was ambitious. Babur defeated the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Panipat. He established Mughal rule in northern India. But Babur's memoirs reveal something surprisingly human. He complained about the heat. He missed the gardens of Central Asia. He wrote poetry. Conqueror, yes, but also mildly homesick. His grandson Akbar would transform the empire into a powerhouse. Akbar expanded territory, reformed administration, encouraged religious tolerance. He invited scholars of different faiths to debate in his court. He married Rajput princesses to secure alliances. He seemed genuinely interested in building a stable, pluralistic empire, which is refreshing. The Mughal court became wealthy. Art flourished. Architecture blossomed, eventually leading to the reign of Shah Jahan. He is best known for commissioning the Taj Mahal.
Yes.
That Taj Mahal. a marble mausoleum built for his wife Mumtaz Mahal. It is often described as the ultimate symbol of love, which is romantic, though it was also funded by imperial wealth and significant labor. Still, it's very beautiful. Shah Jahan's later years were less poetic. He was overthrown by his son Aurangzeb, because royal families have a strong tradition of dramatic father-son disagreements. Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its largest territorial extent, but his strict policies and constant warfare strained resources. After his death, the empire slowly weakened. Regional powers grew. European trading companies gained influence, and the Mughal Empire, once dazzling, gradually faded into ceremonial status. Now, let's float westward, to Anatolia, where a small frontier principality grew into something enormous. The Ottoman Empire, founded around 1299 by Osman I. At first, it was modest. Border raids, regional skirmishes. But over centuries, it expanded across Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. In 1453, Mehmed II captured Constantinople, which had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years. That was not a small moment. The city became Istanbul. The Ottomans positioned themselves as heirs to Roman imperial legacy. They developed sophisticated administration, legal systems, military structures like the Janissaries. Sultans ruled with immense authority. But succession?
Ah, yes.
Ottoman succession often involved brothers competing for the throne. In some periods, newly crowned sultans executed their brothers to prevent civil war, which is one solution, a very final solution. Later, they shifted to confining potential rivals in palace quarters known as the kafes. Imagine growing up knowing you might become sultan, or spend your life in semi-isolated luxury waiting. Not exactly relaxing. Still, the Ottoman Empire endured for over 6 centuries. It adapted, reformed, modernized, and eventually dissolved after World War I. But for a long stretch of history, it was one of the most powerful political entities in the world. As you rest there now, notice how each empire shares something familiar. Immense ambition, strategic brilliance, administrative innovation, and always very human rulers, homesick conquerors, philosopher kings, obsessive unifiers, suspicious sons, power at scale, emotion at scale. Asia has seen empires rise from grasslands, river valleys, deserts, and coastal ports. Some ruled through tolerance, some through terror, most through a mixture of both. And each one believed, in its prime, that it might last forever, which is almost sweet. We'll continue drifting through more imperial stories in part 3. For now, let the horses slow. Let the marble domes glow faintly in the distance. Let the sultans quietly argue somewhere far away. And just rest. Part 3. The Tang, the Timurids, and the calm confidence of people who thought they'd figured it out.
All right.
Settle back in. Adjust the pillows slightly. Let your breathing slow down again. We're continuing our gentle glide through Asia's most powerful empires. No sudden plot twists. No dramatic drum rolls. Just calm authority. And rulers who absolutely believed history revolved around them. Let's drift back to China, to a dynasty that many historians quietly nod at and say, yes, that one was impressive. The Tang dynasty, founded in 618 CE, lasted nearly 3 centuries, which in empire years is basically excellent long-term planning. The Tang period is often described as a golden age. Cultural flourishing,
Poetry, art,
international trade. The capital, Chang'an, was one of the largest cities in the world. Merchants from Central Asia walked its streets. Scholars debated philosophy. Diplomats negotiated alliances. It was cosmopolitan in a way that feels almost modern. And at the center of this stability was a strong bureaucratic system. Civil service examinations, merit-based appointments, Confucian ideals carefully woven into governance, which sounds calm, organized, rational. But of course, this is still imperial politics. Enter Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. She began as a concubine, worked her way up, navigated palace intrigue with extraordinary skill. By 690, she declared her own Zhou dynasty. Because if you've made it that far, why not go all the way? Wu Zetian promoted capable officials, supported Buddhism, expanded the examination system. She was intelligent, ruthless when necessary, deeply aware of perception. Later historians, mostly male Confucian scholars, painted her as manipulative and cruel, which may be partially true, but also slightly suspicious in tone. Powerful women in history rarely get described as pleasant. After her death, the Tang continued, prospered, until things began to wobble. The Inlushan rebellion in the mid-8th century weakened central authority. Regional military governors gained power. Gradually, the empire fragmented, which feels familiar by now. Strong start, flourishing middle, slow unraveling. Let's gently shift west to Central Asia and Persia, where a conqueror emerged in the 14th century who looked at the legacy of the Mongols and thought, I can work with this. His name was Timur, also known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan's line, though not directly through the main branch. But that didn't stop him. He built the Timurid Empire. Through military campaigns across Persia, Central Asia, parts of India, and the Middle East. Timur was a skilled strategist, also extremely severe in warfare. We'll glide past the harsher details tonight. Just imagine very determined sieges. But here's the interesting contrast. Timur loved architecture, scholarship,
art.
He made Samarkand a dazzling capital, blue-tiled mosques, grand madrasas, carefully planned urban design. So, on one hand, relentless conquest. On the other, patron of culture. Because human beings contain multitudes. After Timur's death in 1405, the empire struggled. His descendants ruled various territories, but unity dissolved. However, one branch of his lineage would later help found the Mughal Empire in India. So even in decline, influence lingered. Let's drift further east again, to Korea. The Goryeo, a dynasty that unified much of the Korean peninsula. It endured Mongol invasions, negotiated survival, maintained cultural identity. Goryeo produced exquisite Celadon pottery, advanced printing techniques. Even under Mongol pressure, it adapted, which is its own kind of power. Sometimes the strongest empires are not the largest, but the most resilient. Now, let's glide down towards Southeast Asia, to an empire that ruled the seas, the Srivijaya, from the 7th to the 13th century. Centered in Sumatra, Srivijaya controlled key maritime trade routes through the Strait of Malacca. If you wanted your goods moving between India and China, you passed through their waters, which meant taxes, influence,
Wealth.
They supported Buddhist learning, maintained naval strength. Yet much of their history is pieced together from foreign sources, because tropical climates are not kind to written records. Over time, regional rivals and shifting trade patterns weakened them. But for centuries, they dominated maritime Southeast Asia. Let's float gently back to China one more time, to the Ming Dynasty. Founded after the collapse of Mongol rule in China, the Ming restored Han Chinese governance, strengthened the Great Wall, reinforced central authority. And during the early 15th century, they launched extraordinary naval expeditions. Led by Zheng He commanded vast treasure fleets, ships that dwarfed European vessels of the time. They sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, displaying wealth, diplomacy, soft power. And then, the voyages stopped. Court politics shifted. Funding priorities changed. The empire turned inward. Because empires don't just expand or collapse. Sometimes they simply decide to stay home. The Ming ruled for nearly 3 centuries, eventually facing internal rebellion and external pressure from the Manchus. And in 1644, the dynasty fell. As you lie there now, half drifting, notice how none of these empires were simple. They were not just armies and borders. They were bureaucrats drafting policies by candlelight, poets composing verses about exile, emperors worrying about heirs, generals calculating supply lines. Power is administrative. Power is personal. And often, power is fragile in ways no one admits until it's too late. Asia's empires rose from grasslands, river valleys, mountains, and coastlines. Some lasted decades, some centuries. All believed they were building something permanent, which feels very human. We'll continue this slow drift through more imperial worlds in Part 4. For now, let the Tang poets whisper softly in Chang'an. Let Samarkand's blue domes glow under starlight. Let treasure ships rest quietly at anchor and breathe. Part 4. The Safavids, the Abbasids, and the Qing silk robes, court politics, and the art of looking eternal.
All right.
We're still here.
Still calm.
Still drifting gently through centuries of ambition. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You are now emotionally invested in at least 6 imperial collapses. Let's continue. We'll begin in Persia. Early 16th century. A young leader named Shah Ismail I rose to power with charisma, poetry, and an almost alarming level of self-confidence. He founded the Safavid Empire in 1501. And here's what made the Safavids particularly important. They established Twelvershurism as the state religion of Iran. Not casually, not gradually, very decisively. This shaped Iranian identity for centuries. Ismail was young, militarily gifted, revered by followers who believed he had divine favor, which is a lot of pressure before age 30. At first, everything went very well. Rapid expansion, military success. Then came conflict with the Ottoman Empire. In 1514, Ismail faced the Ottomans at the Battle of Kaldran. The Ottomans had gunpowder artillery. The Safavids did not. It was not ideal. Ismail was defeated. And interestingly, after that loss, he reportedly withdrew somewhat from active leadership, which feels very human. When repeatedly, feel invincible, lose once, question everything. Still, the Safavid state endured. Under later rulers like Shah Abbas I, the empire stabilized and flourished. Shah Abbas reorganized the military, reduced the power of tribal leaders, strengthened central authority. He also beautified the capital, Isfahan. Grand squares, mosques with intricate tilework, architectural elegance that whispers confidence. Trade expanded. Diplomacy connected Safavid Persia with Europe and Asia. For a time, it was prosperous and culturally vibrant. But maintaining balance between military elites, religious authorities, and court factions was never simple. Over time, internal weaknesses grew. External pressures increased. And by the 18th century, Safavid power had faded. But their religious and cultural legacy remained. Now, let's gently float back in time to one of the most intellectually dazzling empires of the medieval world. The Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750, centered in Baghdad. Baghdad at its height was extraordinary. Libraries, hospitals, observatories, scholars translating Greek philosophy into Arabic. The House of Wisdom became a center of learning, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. It was less about constant territorial conquest and more about intellectual power, which is a quieter but deeply influential form of dominance. Caliphs like Harun al-Rashid became legendary figures. Stories in 1001 Nights later romanticized this period. Golden palaces, lavish courts, scholars debating under lamplight. Of course, reality was more complicated. Court politics were intense. Succession disputes were frequent. Provincial governors sometimes acted independently. Gradually, the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented. Regional dynasties rose. The caliph's authority became more symbolic than direct. And in 1258, Mongol forces captured Baghdad. The city suffered immense destruction. The political structure of the Abbasids effectively ended, but the intellectual and cultural contributions endured across the Islamic world. Power shifts. Ideas travel. Now, let's glide east once more, to the 17th century, to the rise of the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus, who conquered Ming China. The Qing rulers were not Han Chinese. They were from Northeast Asia, which meant they had to rule carefully. They preserved Confucian governance, maintained Chinese bureaucratic systems, while also protecting Manchu identity. It was a delicate balance. Under emperors like Kangxi Emperor, the empire expanded significantly. Kangxi ruled for over 60 years. He consolidated borders, promoted stability, patronized scholarship. He even engaged with Jesuit missionaries at court, learning about Western astronomy and science, which feels surprisingly modern. His grandson, Qianlong Emperor, presided over what many consider the Qing's high point. Territory expanded into Central Asia. Art and literature flourished. The imperial collection grew immense. The court radiated confidence. And yet, beneath the elegance, pressures accumulated. Population growth strained resources. Corruption crept into administration. European powers pressed for trade concessions. The Qing court initially viewed foreign states as distant tributaries, which, to be fair, had worked for centuries. But global dynamics were shifting. By the 19th century, internal rebellions and foreign intervention destabilized the dynasty. And in 1912, the Qing dynasty fell, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. As you rest there now, notice how each empire mastered something: military innovation, religious identity, administrative efficiency, cultural brilliance, and yet none mastered permanence. Because permanence is not really an imperial skill set. It's more of a philosophical wish. Asia's most powerful empires shaped continents, redefined religions, built cities that still stand. But they were guided by people. People who worried about heirs, who feared rebellion,
Who aged?
who believed, perhaps sincerely, that their dynasty would last forever. And maybe that belief is necessary. Maybe you can't build something enormous without assuming it will endure, even if history quietly disagrees. We'll continue our slow drift in Part 5. There are still a few imperial giants left to visit. For now, let Isfahan's tiles shimmer faintly. Let Baghdad's scholars murmur softly in the distance. Let the Qing court settle into evening ceremony.
And rest.
Part 5. The Cholas, the Khmer, and the empire that floated on trade winds. All right. One more slow breath. You're doing great. We've crossed grasslands. We've wandered through marble courtyards. We've watched emperors declare themselves chosen by heaven, and then quietly panic about succession. Now, let's drift south to the Indian Ocean, because not all empires marched across land. Some simply rode the wind. We begin with the Chola Empire, based in southern India, rising around the 9th century. If earlier empires were about elephants and land armies, the Cholas looked at the ocean and thought, yes, that. Under rulers like Rajaraja Chola, the empire expanded aggressively. He conquered parts of Sri Lanka, strengthened control over southern India, centralized administration. But here's what makes the Cholas quietly impressive. They built a powerful navy, not a symbolic navy, an actual, strategic, ocean-crossing navy. They launched expeditions into Southeast Asia, engaged in maritime trade, projected influence across the Bay of Bengal. And while doing all this, they built temples, massive temples. The Brihadiswarar temple in Tanjavur still stands. Granite towers, intricate carvings, built in the 11th century. It radiates the calm confidence of a dynasty that assumed it wasn't going anywhere. Chola administration was sophisticated. Village assemblies managed local affairs. Tax systems were detailed, which sounds bureaucratic, but bureaucratic in a productive way. Over time, however, rival kingdoms gained strength. Trade networks shifted, and by the 13th century, Chola dominance had faded. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic collapse, just gradually, which is often how power leaves. Now, let's float east, to mainland Southeast Asia, to the Khmer Empire. Centered in present-day Cambodia, this was the civilization that built Angkor. Under rulers like Suryavarman II, monumental architecture flourished. Angkor what? Vast temple complexes, moats, causeways, an entire urban landscape engineered with hydraulic systems, reservoirs, canals, carefully managed water control. It was both spiritual and practical. Agricultural surplus supported a massive population. The Khmer kings linked divine authority with state power. They were seen as Devaraja, god kings, which is a very bold branding choice. The empire dominated much of mainland Southeast Asia for centuries. But environmental strain, changing trade routes, conflicts with neighboring states like Ayutthaya, all gradually weakened it. By the 15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned. The jungle moved in, which feels poetic. Stone temples standing quietly while vines wrap around them. Power once absolute, now softened by moss. Let's drift north again, to the steppe, to one more empire that quietly influenced global trade. The Timurid Empire we visited earlier left cultural ripples. But further north and west, the Mongol successor state known as the Golden Horde shaped Eurasian politics. They controlled trade routes, extracted tribute from Russian principalities. For centuries, Moscow paid tribute, which subtly influenced Russian political development. Power doesn't just control territory, it shapes psychology. Now, let's turn slightly west again, to Anatolia and beyond, because the Ottoman Empire deserves one final, gentle glance. By the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, it reached extraordinary heights. Territory stretched across 3 continents. Suleiman was called the lawgiver in his own realm. He codified legal systems, strengthened institutions. He also wrote poetry, which is oddly common among emperors. Conquer half the known world, then sit down and compose reflective verses. Ottoman Istanbul flourished. Architectural masterpieces like the Suleimani Mosque defined the skyline. Trade thrived. Diplomacy extended into Europe. For centuries, the empire balanced diversity, multiple religions, languages, cultures, under centralized rule. But industrialization in Europe, economic shifts, and nationalist movements gradually weakened it. By the early 20th century, it dissolved. 600 years of rule, gone in a few decades. Now, as we approach the quiet end of this long imperial journey, notice something. Power in Asia was never isolated. Empires traded with each other, fought each other, copied administrative methods, borrowed religious ideas. The Silk Road connected China to the Middle East. Indian Ocean trade linked India to Southeast Asia and East Africa. Even when armies clashed, ideas traveled. Papermaking, gunpowder, religious philosophy, mathematics. Empires were engines of exchange. And at their centers were people, some visionary, some insecure, some devout, some deeply suspicious of their own relatives. They built capitals, commissioned monuments, declared eternal dynasties. And then, time moved. It always does. The Mauryas,
The Han. The Tang.
the Abbasids, the Mongols, the Mughals, the Safavids, the Ottomans,
The Qing.
the Cholas, the Khmer. Each one believed, at some point, that history had settled into their favor permanently. And for a while it had. Asia's most powerful empires shaped borders, languages, religions, economies. Their influence lingers in architecture, in legal traditions, in cultural memory. But the emperors themselves? They worried. They aged. They made plans that didn't quite work out, which makes them feel oddly familiar. So as you lie there now, comfortably suspended between centuries, let the grand titles fade. Universal ruler, son of heaven, shadow of God on earth. Underneath it all were human beings navigating scale, trying to hold something vast together, sometimes succeeding brilliantly, sometimes watching it slip through their fingers. And maybe that's the quiet thread connecting all of them. Power feels solid in the moment. Marble, granite,
Steel.
but history moves like water,
Slowly.
patiently, reshaping everything. And with that, let the elephants wander off. Let the treasure ships anchor for the night. Let the imperial courts dim their lanterns. You've traveled across centuries without leaving your pillow. That's efficient. Rest now. Part 6. The empire that wouldn't sit still. The Seljuks, the Delhi Sultans, and the calm chaos of expansion.
All right.
We're still drifting, still comfortable, still calmly observing centuries of people who absolutely believed they had things under control. We've covered giants. We've admired marble. We've watched dynasties glow and gently dim. But Asia is very large, and history is stubbornly full. So, let's glide back to the 11th century, to a group who arrived with horses, confidence, and a firm belief in divine endorsement. The Seljuk Empire. Founded by the Seljuk Turks, originally from Central Asia. They moved westward,
Gradually.
purposefully, and by the mid-11th century, they controlled large parts of Persia, Iraq, and Anatolia. In 1055, they entered Baghdad. Now, Baghdad at that time was still symbolically linked to the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliph remained spiritually important, but politically weaker. The Seljuks stepped in as protectors, military strongmen with administrative sense, which is a familiar pattern. They didn't erase Persian culture. They adopted it. Persian bureaucrats served in government. Islamic scholarship continued. The Seljuks blended Turkic military traditions with Persian administrative sophistication. It was a surprisingly smooth fusion. Under leaders like Alp Arslan, they expanded into Anatolia. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they defeated the Byzantine Empire. which shifted the balance of power in the region. Anatolia slowly became more Turkic and Islamic. A very long-term transformation. But like many empires built on rapid expansion, cohesion was delicate. After strong sultans died, rival claimants emerged. Regional governors asserted independence. By the late 12th century, Seljuk unity weakened. Still, their influence shaped the Middle East profoundly. Now, let's drift southeast, to the Indian subcontinent again, where the Delhi Sultanate rose in the early 13th century. Founded after the decline of earlier Turkic rulers in northern India, it wasn't a single dynasty.
It was a series of them.
Mamluks, Khaljis, Tughlaqs, each with ambitious leaders, each with their own ideas about governance. One particularly memorable ruler was Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Now, historians often describe him as brilliant but impulsive. He attempted bold reforms. He tried to move the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, which involved relocating a massive population. It did not go smoothly. He introduced token currency made of base metals, which people immediately began counterfeiting. Because if you invent money that's easy to fake, people will absolutely test that theory. Still, the Delhi Sultanate maintained control over vast territories in northern India for centuries. It developed administrative systems, managed diverse populations, but constant rebellions and regional pressures made stability fragile. Eventually, in 1526, it fell to Babur, and the Mughal Empire began. History doesn't leave space empty for long. Now, let's glide back to East Asia once more. Because while China often grabs attention, Japan quietly built its own unique imperial structure, the Tokugawa shogunate. Founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu after decades of civil war, the emperor remained, but largely symbolic. Real power rested with the shogun. Tokugawa rule brought stability, strict social hierarchy, samurai at the top, merchants at the bottom, which is ironic, because merchants often ended up quite wealthy. The Tokugawa implemented sakoku, a policy of limited foreign contact. Japan turned inward, controlled trade through specific ports, carefully monitored Christianity. For over 2 centuries, this system maintained peace. No large-scale civil wars. Urban culture flourished. Kabuki theater, woodblock prints, poetry. But by the 19th century, external pressures arrived. Western powers demanded trade access. And eventually, internal reformers restored imperial authority under the Meiji Restoration. The Tokugawa system dissolved. Another long period of stability, gently ending. Now, let's drift back towards Southeast Asia, to the Ayutthaya Kingdom. Located in present-day Thailand, Ayutthaya became a regional powerhouse, strategically positioned in trade networks, diplomatically savvy. They engaged with Chinese merchants, Persian traders, European envoys. The court was cosmopolitan. Kings adopted elaborate rituals reinforcing divine authority. The kingdom expanded, consolidated influence over surrounding regions. But warfare with neighboring Burma eventually proved devastating. In 1767, Ayutthaya was sacked. The city burned. Yet from that collapse rose the kingdom of Siam under a new dynasty. Again, power doesn't disappear. It shifts. As we gently near the end of this long imperial drift, something becomes clear. Asia's most powerful empires were not isolated chapters. They overlapped, influenced one another, borrowed technologies, shared religious ideas. Gunpowder moved from China westward. Paper traveled across continents. Administrative concepts evolved and reappeared in new forms. Every empire thought it was unique, and in some ways it was. But they all faced similar challenges: succession disputes, overextension, economic strain, environmental pressures, and always
Time.
time that moves calmly, patiently, long after banners fall. You might notice that no empire on this list truly failed in a dramatic sense. They transformed, fragmented, were absorbed, but their cultural fingerprints remained in language, in architecture, in legal systems. And maybe that's the quiet truth beneath all this grandeur. Empires feel permanent when you stand inside them. Markets bustle, courts function, taxes are collected. It feels solid, but centuries later, it becomes a chapter, a section in a book, a marble ruin wrapped in vines. And yet, the people living inside those empires likely felt just as certain about their present as we do about ours, which is a mildly humbling thought. So now, as we close this final stretch of imperial wandering, let the Seljuk cavalry fade into the horizon. Let Delhi's minarets stand quietly in moonlight. Let Edo's lanterns dim. Let Ayutthaya's rivers flow calmly past. Asia has carried empires across millennia, some dazzling, some severe, all deeply human. And you've just floated through them without lifting a sword. Very efficient.
Now, rest.
Part 7. The empire that wasn't supposed to work. The Umayyads of Cordoba, the Joseon kings, and the gentle exhaustion of holding it all together.
All right.
One last slow drift. One more soft stretch across the centuries. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've now survived more dynastic turnovers than most medieval courtiers. Very impressive. Tonight, or rather, this final stretch, we're not chasing the biggest empires by landmass. We're looking at empires and imperial systems that held serious power, shaped entire regions, and quietly wrestled with the exhausting reality of ruling human beings. Let's begin in Iberia. Yes, technically just west of Asia, but deeply tied to the Islamic world that stretched from Central Asia to Spain. The Umayyad Caliphate originally ruled from Damascus, but after it fell in 750 to the Abbasids, one surviving prince escaped. His name was Abd ar-Rahman I. He fled across North Africa, arrived in Iberia, and calmly rebuilt power from scratch, which is either extremely impressive or extremely stubborn. He founded the Emirate of Cordoba, and later, his descendants declared the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929. For a time, Cordoba became one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. Libraries, public baths, street lighting, scholars translating works of philosophy and science. It was connected intellectually to Baghdad and culturally to the broader Islamic world. And yet, even here, court politics hummed in the background. Succession disputes, regional tensions. By the early 11th century, the caliphate fragmented into smaller taifa kingdoms. Brilliant, influential, and ultimately divided. Because unity, as we've seen repeatedly tonight, requires constant maintenance. Now, let's drift back to East Asia, to Korea, to the Joseon dynasty, founded in 1392, lasting over 5 centuries, which is not small. Joseon was deeply Confucian, highly bureaucratic, scholarly to its core. The civil service examination system shaped elite life. Yongban scholar officials debated ethics. Agricultural reforms were introduced. Records were meticulously kept. Under Sejong the Great in the 15th century, the Korean script Hangul was created. Now that's lasting power. Designing an alphabet that remains in use centuries later. Sejong supported science, astronomy, agricultural improvements, calm, practical governance. But Joseon kings often struggled with factionalism. Court politics were subtle, layered, exhausting. Scholars split into rival groups. Policies became ideological battlegrounds. At times, purges removed entire factions from power. Not dramatic sword fights, just political erasure. Over time, external pressures grew. Japanese invasions in the 1590s. Later Manchu invasions. Joseon survived, adapted, retreated inward at times. But by the late 19th century, global imperial competition overwhelmed the old system. And in 1910, Korea was annexed by Japan. 5 centuries of dynastic rule concluded, not with a whisper, but with exhaustion. Now, let's gently return to China one last time, because we haven't yet talked about the Song dynasty, and they deserve a quiet moment. The Song did not dominate vast territories like the Han or Tang. Militarily, they were often on the defensive, but economically and technologically, remarkable. Urbanization increased. Paper money circulated. Printing technology expanded literacy. Gunpowder weapons developed further. It was an era of innovation. But the Song court constantly faced pressure from northern nomadic states. First the Liao, then the Jin, eventually the Mongols. The southern Song retreated below the Yangtze River. They governed efficiently, promoted commerce, but military weakness haunted them. In 1279, the Mongols completed their conquest. The Song dynasty ended. Yet its economic and cultural contributions deeply shaped later China. Power isn't always about conquest. Sometimes it's about refinement. And that matters. Now, let's take one final gentle look at a maritime powerhouse, the Majapahit, centered in Java. In the 14th century, it dominated much of maritime Southeast Asia. Control over trade routes. Influence over surrounding islands. Its prime minister, Gajah Mada, famously vowed not to enjoy spices until he had unified the archipelago, which is an oddly specific motivational strategy. Majapahit oversaw a flourishing court culture, literature, religious diversity. But trade patterns shifted. Islamic sultanates rose in the region, and gradually Majapahit faded, not erased, but absorbed into new political realities. And here we are, after 7 long, quiet drifts across centuries. What have we seen? Grassland conquerors, maritime traders, scholar officials, poet emperors. We've seen marble monuments, hydraulic cities, gunpowder revolutions. We've watched ambitious founders build something enormous. And then we've watched their successors try, sometimes desperately, to keep it steady. Asia's most powerful empires were never static. They were living systems. They breathed, expanded, adjusted, struggled. They were shaped by geography, by trade routes, by climate, by religion, but mostly by people. People who believed they were standing at the center of history. And in their moment, they were. If there's a quiet theme across all of this, it's that power is heavy. It requires constant negotiation, constant adaptation. And even the most confident dynasty eventually faces a horizon it cannot cross. Not because it failed entirely, but because time simply keeps moving. And now, as this final part comes to rest, let the palaces fade. Let the banners lower. Let the treasure fleets settle into calm waters. You've traveled from the Mauryas to the Majapahit, from steppe cavalry to scholar bureaucrats, all without leaving your pillow. Very efficient imperial management. History can be loud, chaotic, violent, but when viewed from a distance, it becomes rhythmic, predictable, almost soothing.
Rise.
Flourish, strain, transform, and somewhere inside each empire, a ruler staring at a map, wondering how long it can possibly last. You can stop wondering now.
You can rest.
Part 8. The Last Lanterns, when empires realize they're tired. All right, this is the very last drift. No more cavalry. No more marble. Just the soft afterglow of very large political experiments. By now, you've probably noticed something. Empires don't usually explode in one dramatic moment. They stretch. They strain. They reorganize the paperwork. They tell everyone everything is fine. And then, very slowly, they get tired. Let's begin in the 18th and 19th centuries. Because this is when many of Asia's great imperial systems faced something new. Not just rival kingdoms. Not just steppe invasions. But industrialized European powers with steamships, rifles, and an alarming enthusiasm for trade imbalances. We already visited the Qing dynasty. For centuries, it had been stable, confident, comfortable in its worldview. Foreign states were tributaries. The emperor was the son of heaven. It worked, until it didn't. By the 19th century, internal rebellions erupted. The Taiping Rebellion alone lasted over a decade. It devastated vast regions. Meanwhile, foreign powers demanded trade concessions. The Opium Wars forced unequal treaties. Ports were opened. The Qing court tried reforms. Self-strengthening movements. Military modernization. But reform inside a deeply layered imperial bureaucracy is like trying to renovate a palace while everyone still lives inside it. Messy. By 1911, revolution spread. And in 1912, the last emperor, Puyi, abdicated. 2,000 years of imperial rule in China ended. Not with a thunderclap, but with paperwork. Now drift south to India again. The Mughal Empire we visited earlier had already weakened by the 18th century. Regional powers gained autonomy. European trading companies expanded influence. The British East India Company gradually moved from merchant to ruler. After the rebellion of 1857, the British Crown formally ended Mughal sovereignty. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was exiled. An empire that once built the Taj Mahal now existed mostly in poetry and memory. Power had shifted, not erased, just transferred. Now, let's gently glance at the Ottoman Empire one final time. By the 19th century, it was often called the sick man of Europe, which is not the most flattering nickname. Reforms were attempted. The Tanzimat period introduced modernization efforts, new legal codes, administrative restructuring. But nationalist movements grew within its diverse territories. Wars chipped away at land. And after World War I, the empire formally dissolved. 6 centuries.
Gone.
In its place, new nation-states. The Sultan's long arc of authority closed quietly. Now, something interesting happens at this point in history. Imperial systems don't disappear entirely. They evolve. Japan, after the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, modernized rapidly under the emperor. The Meiji Restoration centralized power again. In a different form. Industrial. National. Not feudal. Korea, after the Joseon dynasty, faced annexation and later division. China moved from empire to republic to civil war to a new political system entirely. The shapes changed, but the scale of governance remained vast. Asia did not become smaller. It reorganized. And if you zoom out very far out, you can see something almost peaceful about it. For thousands of years, empires rose across Asia. Mauryas,
Han. Tang.
Abbasids, Mongols, Mughals, Safavids, Ottomans,
Qing.
Cholas,
Khmer.
Seljuks, Delhi Sultans, Majapahit. They governed farmers and merchants, built roads, standardized weights, collected taxes, argued about succession. Some were brutal, some were reformist. Most were a mixture of both. And none of them lasted forever, which, oddly, makes the pattern itself feel permanent.
Rise.
Administration, expansion, strain, adaptation, transformation, over and over. The most powerful empires in Asian history shaped trade routes that still matter, borders that still influence politics, cultural identities that still define nations. Their monuments stand, their languages survive, their laws echo faintly in modern systems. But their rulers? They were temporary, just people in robes, looking at maps, trying to keep everything from unraveling. And perhaps that's the softest truth of all this. Power feels solid in the present, but from the distance of centuries, it becomes a chapter, a stone ruin, a faded inscription, a story told in a calm voice while someone lies comfortably in the dark. You've just traveled through more than 2,000 years of imperial ambition, without raising taxes, without leading an army, extremely efficient.
So now,
let the banners fall gently. Let the palaces dim. Let the treasure fleets remain docked. History keeps moving. But you don't have to. You can stay exactly where you are.
and rest.
Part 9. When the river became a road. For thousands of years, human beings had followed animals. Now, they began to follow water. The banks of the great rivers, the Nile River, the Tigris River and Euphrates River, the Indus River, the Yellow River, were not merely places to drink. They were magnets. Water meant fish. Fish meant food.
Food meant staying.
Staying meant building. And building, as it turned out, changed everything. At first, it was seasonal. Groups would drift toward rivers during certain months, then scatter again when waters fell or herds moved. But over generations, the pattern shifted. People began experimenting with something radical. Planting. Not just gathering what nature offered, but deliberately pressing seeds into soil and waiting. It was a dangerous gamble. A hunter could chase a herd and, if lucky, return with meat. A farmer had to trust time itself. But along the fertile floodplains of the Nile River, something remarkable happened. Each year, the river overflowed its banks, leaving behind dark, rich silt. Crops grew reliably.
Predictably.
Predictability is addictive. Along the twin arteries of the Tigris River and Euphrates River, communities learned to dig canals, to coax water where it was needed. It required cooperation. It required planning. It required trust. And trust slowly built cities. The shift was not immediate. It was not uniform. Some groups clung to movement, maintaining nomadic traditions for millennia. Others embraced settlement and watched their populations swell. In the floodplains of the Indus River, early urban centers rose with remarkable organization. Straight streets, drainage systems, brick houses aligned with astonishing precision. In East Asia, near the Yellow River, millet and later rice cultivation reshaped entire societies. Food surplus did something strange to the human story. It freed time, and free time is dangerous. When not everyone needed to hunt or harvest, some people began to specialize. Potters, builders, traders, priests, storytellers,
Scribes.
Memory moved from mouth to clay. Symbols were pressed into tablets in Mesopotamia, carved into stone along the Nile River, scratched into bone and shell in ancient China. Migration did not stop. It changed form. Now, instead of entire communities drifting together, movement often happened in threads. A trader journeying between settlements. A family leaving crowded farmland for frontier soil. A warrior band seeking new territory. Roads began as footpaths. Footpaths became routes. Routes became networks. The river, once merely a boundary, became a highway. But there was a cost. Settlements meant proximity. Proximity meant disease. For the first time in human history, populations were dense enough for illnesses to spread widely. Domesticated animals, sheep, goats, cattle, carried pathogens humans had never encountered before. Some communities suffered greatly. Others adapted. Migration once again acted as a safety valve. Groups moved away from outbreak zones. Knowledge of sickness traveled with them.
So did immunity.
Over generations, agricultural societies expanded outward. Forests were cleared, marshes drained, hills terraced. What had once been wilderness became patchwork landscapes of fields and villages. And still, beyond the edges of these settled worlds, nomadic peoples continued to roam. Herders on vast grasslands, hunters in deep forests, sailors along distant coasts. Humanity had split into multiple rhythms. Some stayed. Some moved. Most did both at different times. The story of migration is not a straight line from wandering to settlement. It is a pulse. In some eras, movement slows, roots deepen, walls rise. In others, pressure builds, climate shifts, resources strain, ambitions grow, and populations spill outward once more. Rivers anchor, plains invite, mountains protect, seas connect, and through it all people keep walking. By the time the first cities emerged, migration had already shaped language families, genetic patterns, trade routes, and mythologies. Entire civilizations rested on the quiet decisions of ancestors who chose to cross one more ridge, follow one more valley, plant one more seed. The earth itself bears their footsteps, beneath highways, under skyscrapers, beneath layers of forgotten soil. You are sitting, perhaps right now, in a place that was once someone's frontier, someone's risk, someone's migration. And the journey, though slower now, has never truly stopped. Part 10. Threads across time, cities, trade, and the gentle pull of human movement.
All right.
Let's continue our quiet journey. If Part 9 was about rivers shaping settlement, Part 10 is about how those settlements began to talk to each other. Not literally, of course, but through trade, ideas, and the subtle hum of human connection. Once people stayed in one place long enough to build a village, they discovered something obvious. Others had things you wanted.
Pottery, salt,
Spices, knowledge of astronomy or medicine. And those others wanted something from you in return. So trade routes slowly grew. Paths widened. Caravans loaded with goods stretched over hundreds of miles. Ships hugged coastlines, relying on wind and tide. The world, already vast, became smaller. Let's drift gently toward Mesopotamia. The Sumer had built city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates. They traded grain for timber from the north, metals from distant hills, luxury items from lands they had never seen. Trade was never just about goods. It carried stories. It carried religious ideas. It carried technology. A tablet with cuneiform might explain irrigation. A piece of imported lapis lazuli might inspire new artistic patterns. Movement became cultural osmosis. In South Asia, the Indus Valley civilizations were doing something similar. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, well-planned streets, water management systems, standardized weights and measures. They traded with Mesopotamia. It's astonishing how far a bead or a ceramic vessel could travel. People were moving and exchanging knowledge long before we built empires in the conventional sense. Meanwhile, in East Asia, along the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, settlements were growing. Rice terraces, irrigation networks, town markets where traders from distant valleys bargained over salt, silk, and pottery. Even in these early times, the world became a web, and human migration continued to thread through it. Nomads still roamed beyond settled lands. The steppe remained a highway for cavalry. Generations of herders moved according to season, water, and grazing patterns. Sometimes they clashed with settled states. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they became rulers themselves. The Mongols would later take this principle to an extreme. But that's for later. For now, it's enough to notice the rhythm, settle,
Trade.
move again. Even the smallest migrations shaped the world. A family seeking fertile ground for crops. A caravan changing its route because of bandits. A scholar traveling to study under a distant teacher. Every choice rippled. Every step influenced someone else somewhere else. And that's the gentle, invisible force connecting all the empires we've been talking about. Because every empire, Tang, Timurid, Mughal, Qing, Chola, Khmer, Seljuk, Joseon, all relied on this network of movement.
People. Goods.
Ideas. Knowledge.
Culture.
Migration wasn't just a prelude to empire. It was the lifeblood that allowed cities to exist, economies to flourish, and rulers to dream of permanence. By the time trade networks expanded across the Indian Ocean, the Silk Road, and maritime Southeast Asia, migration had transformed from instinctive survival to deliberate strategy. Merchants planned routes. Scholars planned journeys. Explorers took risks they hoped would pay off. And in the background, ordinary people continued to move quietly, relocating farms, joining armies, or simply following better land. All of this laid the groundwork for the empires we explored in earlier parts. The wealth of the Tang, the maritime power of Srivijaya, the urban sophistication of Majapahit. None of it was possible without these subtle currents of movement, threading human lives together. So, as you rest here, gently aware of your own small place in this continuum, remember, empires rise, empires fall, but human movement endures. Footsteps across floodplains, caravans across deserts, boats along coasts. Stories passed from one generation to the next, all of it quietly shaping the world we inherit. And now, the rivers, the roads, and the trading paths settle into shadow. The pulse of migration slows for the night. The world continues to move, but you can pause.
And rest.
We can continue to part 11 next, tracing more human journeys that gave rise to later empires and civilizations. Do you want me to continue?